Hello and welcome to our fifth whiskey tasting session. It is very good to have you here with us again. So for this whiskey tasting session, we will be celebrating exclusively Irish whiskies. Are you a fan of any Irish whiskies at all? Okay. So for today's sampling session, we have 6 different whiskies from 6 different brands. We have Powers Gold Label, we have Bushmills Black Bush, we have Slane, which is a newer company's standard whiskey, we have Teeling's Small Batch, we have Tullamore Dew's Rum Cask Irish Whiskey, and we have a liqueur, but we'll count it for today's Irish whiskey session, from Jameson, which is their newer product, Jameson Orange. So for today's whiskey tasting session, I have provided you with a Glencairn glass. I also have one myself. Now, this is a newer addition to our whiskey tastings. The Glencairn glass is exceptionally useful for all forms of whiskies, bourbon, Canadian, Irish, Scotch, whichever you prefer. The reason for this is it has a narrow top to it and a wide base. So this means that when you swirl the whiskey around, you are releasing deeper aromas and flavours to the surface. This gives the whiskey more time and movement to rise, and you'll be able to smell and taste different parts of the whiskey that you may not be able to experience in another type of glass. However, should you not like the Glencairn glass, we of course also have for you the standard sipping glass, whiskey stones, ice, whatever you prefer to add to your whiskey for today's tasting. Of course. So, I figured before we begin delving into trying these wonderful whiskies, it might be important to remind you about some of Ireland's legal requirements to create its whiskies. Okay? So to create Irish whiskey, it must be made in either the Republic of Ireland or Northern Ireland. It must include malted barley and may include other unmalted cereal grains. There are 4 types of Irish whiskey: pot still, grain, malt, and blended. It must be mashed, fermented, and distilled to no more than 94.8% alcohol by volume, and it must be matured in wooden casks such as oak, but the casks must not exceed 700 litres each, and it must be matured for a minimum of 3 years in Ireland, Northern Ireland, or the Republic of Ireland. It must be bottled at no less than 40% alcohol by volume, and it must not contain additives other than water and one specific caramel colouring, which is E150A. And it must contain typical characteristics of its raw materials, and it must smell and taste like a whiskey. Other than that, each Irish whiskey distillery is able to explore creating Irish whiskies as they please. So as this is your 5th whiskey tasting with us, I figured it would be important before we try the Irish whiskies today to discuss with you the differences between chill filtration and non-chill filtration. So you will see that each whiskey likes to discuss if it uses each of these methods for the creation process of the whiskey. but I'd like to explain to you what exactly that those terms mean. So all whiskey is in one way or another filtered before bottling, but chill filtration is an additional process that is done to the whiskey to remove chemical compounds such as fatty acids from the whiskey. Fatty acids can clump together at low temperatures, specifically when you add ice to the whiskey, and this can create a cloudy or hazy appearance to the whiskey. This doesn't necessarily do anything wrong when it appears cloudy or hazy, but many people can find that aesthetically displeasing. This typically only occurs with whiskies that are 46% alcohol by volume or less. However, there are many distilleries out there that specifically make their whiskies at 50% alcohol by volume or higher, specifically to prohibit and prevent the cloudy appearance from ever occurring. So instead of creating a 50% alcohol by volume whiskey, for the taste, a lot of whiskies will opt for the additional 4% alcohol by volume just to prevent that cloudy look to their whiskey. The process of chill filtration can be either through paper, metal, or earth. However, very rarely will a distillery ever discuss what specific method it uses for its chill filtration method. It has long been argued by all distilleries if a whiskey should be chill filtered or non-chill filtered, and as most whiskies fit right in the range between 40 to 50% alcohol by volume, it is a method that needs to be at least discussed by companies before they ever start creating their whiskey. Non-chill filtration simply means that it does not go through this process, so if I ever say that a whiskey is chill filtered or non-chill filtered, that is exactly what it means. Okay, so now let's begin by having a look at Bushmills Black Bush. You may feel free to sample any of the whiskies today in front of you or pass, whatever you're comfortable with. Okay, so this specific product by Bushmills is not their flagship product, but is another recipe that they've come up with. This is a 40% alcohol by volume triple distilled whiskey by Bushmills. So Bushmills has a wonderfully long and interesting history to the company. The Bushmills product is made at the old Bushmills distillery in a small village called Bushmills in County Antrim in Northern Ireland. The factory dates all the way back to 1784, even after it was burned and rebuilt in 1885, it remains today. However, the drink was officially recognised in 1608, and a royal licence was granted Sir Thomas Phillips by King James I to allow him to distill whiskey. That is why you see the number 1608 printed on the front. Interestingly, the company Bushmills had a steamship called SS Bushmills that started its maiden voyage in 1890 across the Atlantic to deliver whiskey to America. Despite the American prohibition, Bushmills was able to survive. The company has traded hands several times over the years, but it did eventually settle into the ownership of Casa Cuervo in 2014. So this specific product, Black Bush, is a combination of 80% malt barley and 20% grain whiskey. Bushmills Black Bush is similar to the original recipe in that it uses a blend of malt whiskey and a bit of Irish single grain whiskey to soften it, but the real difference comes from the aging process and colour of this specific recipe. Not only is this a darker colour, but this is aged for 8 years in ex Oloroso sherry casks, so this gives it a much more spicy flavour. So now let's have a look at the whiskey in greater detail. The colour on this one is a pale honey colour, from what I can see. Have you ever had the original Bushmills whiskey? Okay, so this is much more peppery than the original. This has very heavy sherry aromas throughout, and that comes from the cask, allowing the scent to release up the Glencairn glass. And you give it some time, you can smell light and gentle scents of blood orange, dried fruits, plums, certainly an assortment of berries, and prunes. I can smell prunes in this. What do you think? Yes, it is spicy. So, you may now feel free to try the Bushmills Black Bush in any way that you desire. Peppery, like the scent. The sherry taste to this is bitter rather than sweet, which is surprising but very interesting. There are notes of cherry, dried fruits, some citrusy flavours like lemon, orange certainly. The finish is medium to long. Now you can taste the grain more so at the end, certainly with a combination of grape, pears, apple. Yes. What do you think? Interesting. Very interesting. Okay, so now let's move on to the next whiskey. We're going to be moving on to Powers Gold Label. Have you ever heard of Powers? Okay, so this is their flagship product. This is a 43% alcohol by volume triple distilled blend of pot still and grain whiskey. So Powers Gold Label is the original and first whiskey released by the company, and this specific product was the first Irish whiskey to ever be bottled in-house. Their current distillery was opened in 1975 and is located in Middleton, near Cork. The original recipe for Gold Label was a single pot still. A typical pot still process basically means that it's made from a mash of a minimum of 30% malted and a minimum of 30% unmalted barley, with up to 5% cereals added. A single pot still means that it comes from only one distillery. So, just like Bushmills, Powers has an enormous wealth of history to its company, and I would invite you to hear a little bit about it. Okay, so the history of Powers begins in 1791 when James Powers, an innkeep from Dublin, established John's Lane Distillery, located fairly close to his original public house. Initially they traded as James Power and Son, which grew to become John Power and Son. By 1823, the distilling laws in Ireland had significantly changed, and the distillery as a result grew rapidly, and by 1827 they were producing over 160,000 gallons of whiskey a year. This catapulted to 300,000 gallons a year just 6 years later. Typically, distillers would sell the whiskey to merchants who would then bottle it themselves. However, Powers was the first Irish distiller to begin bottling on its home soil, and was one of the first in the world to do so. So this is not Powers' original recipe. The Gold Label recipe was originally a single pot still, but over the years it has changed, and its current recipe is a blend of pot still and grain whiskey. It is matured in ex-bourbon American oak casks and is non-chill filtered. The majority of Powers' range, however, are still single pot still whiskies. These include their Three Swallows release and the John's Lane whiskey. Golden Label is triple distilled in copper pot stills. However, what makes the Powers Company so special is that they remove more top and tail from their whiskey than any other Irish whiskey company, leaving a higher quality product for the consumer. Powers whiskey is mostly matured in second and third fill American oak casks to protect the balanced distillate. Afterwards, it is blended with the finest grain whiskey. So Powers did actually remain family owned all the way up until 1966, but it is currently owned by the French company Pernod Ricard. This specific whiskey has no specific age statement to it. However, it is estimated that this whiskey uses a combination of 5 to 7-year-old whiskies to create it. So let's have a look at this one in greater detail. So in the Glencairn glass here, it has a beautiful amber colour to it. Very sweet shortbread notes to this one. Notes of honeysuckle. And when it rises to the surface, tangerine peel. Definitely tangerine peel. So to try this one on the palate. It is buttery, just like it is on the nose. There are notes of cereal, pears, and certainly notes of cocoa on this one. It has a short, mouth-watering finish and mouthfeel to it. However, spices shine right through at the end here, and there are waves of honey lingering to the end. So what do you think of this one? Interesting. Okay. So now let's move on to the next whiskey in this lineup of Irish whiskies. I say that very loosely and lightly for the reason that this next whiskey is technically not an Irish whiskey. So, still, however, created by the very famous Irish whiskey company Jameson. This is a newer release from them, Jameson Orange. However, because it is a 30% alcohol by volume drink, it is not legally a whiskey. Despite being blended with Jameson's whiskies, this would be considered a liqueur instead. So let's have a look at this one in a little bit of greater detail. So this is a newer product from Jameson. They have stepped into the flavoured whiskey market, which has been taken over and popularised in the last few years. Evan Williams has created several flavours, including apple and orange. Jim Beam has released orange, cherry, cinnamon. Lots of different flavours are flying around the whiskey world at the moment, so it's a hot iron to strike, and I'm not surprised that Jameson joined the fold on this one. So this was released in the UK in August of 2021, and this was released in the United States in January of 2022. So this is a little bit more of a summery drink, and Jameson created this as a tribute to the old-fashioned. As you, I'm sure, are aware, the old-fashioned is made of a combination of orange, bitters, and simple syrup. So this drink, fascinatingly though, is not just Jameson blended whiskey with some orange thrown in. this specific whiskey uses natural orange flavouring, which is really strong and will come through when you smell and drink it very clearly. So this one you can feel free to try with the glass of lemonade or cranberry juice alongside you, or you can drink this straight or on the rocks. I've provided this to you today because it was suggested by Jameson themselves, but you can feel free to try it however you please. So a little bit of history about Jameson before we delve into the sampling. Now, I know that you've experienced Jameson's whiskies at our tasting sessions here, what with the flagship product and the Black Barrel, but I'd like to let you know a little bit more of the history of the product. So Jameson has a very rich history. It is the best-selling Irish whiskey, and it has consecutively grown as a company for the past 30 years. So Jameson is a blended Irish whiskey, also now owned by Pernod Ricard, like Powers. Their distillery is also in New Middleton in County Cork, just like Powers again. The company was founded by John Jameson, who was ironically a Scotsman. He married Margaret Haig, who was the daughter of the very famous John Haig, who created the aforementioned Scotch whisky. The couple had 16 children together. He founded his distillery in 1780 on Bow Street, and 25 years later, his son John Jameson II took the business over, who also handed it to his son in 1851. However, 4 of his 8 sons overall all worked in different areas to support the business. It has a very interesting history to Jameson, and that's only just a small portion of it. So let's have a look at this one now. So the colour on this one is a medium amber, I would say. And despite this expectation of pure orange coming through on the nose, it's actually a well-balanced scent. There are aromas of not just natural oils of orange, but zesty peels and ripe orange juice. It's a sweet scented whiskey with very, very clean undertones to it. What do you think? Yes, the smell of the orange on this one is certainly beautiful. It can be a little bit overwhelming though, yes. So I invite you now to try this. You can, of course, feel free to pass or try it as they recommend it. Okay. This has a very delicate, smooth mouthfeel to it. There are clear notes of orange zest with this one, flavours of spice, nuttiness, and sweet vanilla throughout. You can taste Jameson's typical blended whiskey infused into this, but the orange does shine as the leader for this particular whiskey liqueur. What do you think of this one? It does tend to drown out the typical Jameson taste with that natural orange flavouring, but it is still refreshing and probably best enjoyed in the summertime, the warmer months, probably as a cocktail of some sort, perhaps. Okay, so now let's move on to our 4th whiskey for our whiskey tasting session here today. So now I invite you to have a look at and try our next whiskey, which is Slane. Have you ever heard of Slane whiskey? Okay, I'll be happy to tell you a little bit more about them. So Slane Whiskey is actually a rather new whiskey company. Their distillery was founded in 2017, so very new to the market. This is their standard product. This is a 40% alcohol by volume, triple distilled and triple whiskey used whiskey. So what this means is that they use 3 different types of whiskies, which are triple distilled, and then they are blended together to create one whiskey overall. This whiskey is also chill filtered. So the reason that this company was created is, according to the owners, in the hopes of reviving the whiskey industry in Boyne Valley. And Boyne Valley once had a very rich history when it comes to creating whiskies. However, it did suffer a severe downfall, and Slane Whiskey is one of the newer distilleries to actually open in Boyne Valley. So it's nice to see them try to revitalise the efforts of whiskey distillation in the area. Close by, however, is the Whistler Distillery, if you've ever heard of it. This specific distillery can be found in the stables of the iconic 250-year-old Slane estate, which is next to its castle. It is owned by the American spirits company Brown-Forman, who are the makers of Jack Daniels. It is made in collaboration, however, with the owners of the Slane estate. So to create Slane's distinctive and signature flavour, they combine grain and malt whiskies from 3 different style barrels for a complex triple blend taste. They first use virgin oak casks, then they use seasoned whiskey casks and Oloroso sherry casks. Virgin oak barrels are medium charred, which creates a toasted, smoky vanilla flavour. The seasoned casks are Tennessee barrels, which create the sweeter flavours of caramel, plums, bananas, and butterscotch. And the Oloroso sherry casks contribute flavours of spice and raisin. After aging, the whiskey is then blended, and Slane uses local water for its whiskey process from the River Boyne, which conveniently runs along the distillery. They also use 100% Irish-grown barley, and to distill their whiskey, Slane uses copper stills to create the malt and pot still style whiskey. So let's have a look at this one now. So there's a very clear amber appearance to the whiskey on this one. Now, as this uses whiskies from 3 different barrels, there is going to be a lot going on with the scent and taste of this one. So this is quite complex on the nose. You may interpret this one differently to me. There's no right or wrong answer there. I'm picking up notes of caramel, butterscotch and vanilla, complemented by brown sugar, toasted oak. Interesting. That's a very interesting take on that, yes. Yes. So now on the palate. So it is initially very spicy, but it is very quickly sweetened by this rich caramel, vanilla and butterscotch flavouring with a subtle layer of dried fruit. The finish on this one has lingering hints of dry fruit, caramelized sugar. It's very appetizing, and I feel like with 1 sip in comparison to 2 sips or 3 sips, you're going to get a unique experience each time, and that comes from those triple whiskies blended together. Very, very delicious whiskey. Lots of flavours combined in there, and as mentioned, that dry fruit really does linger right at the end there. I see. It's a very interesting take on that. So now let's move on to the fifth whiskey for today's whiskey tasting. So the next one I'd like to show you, similarly to Slane, is a newer whiskey company called Teeling. This is Teeling's small batch whiskey. Have you ever heard of Teeling? Okay, so this specific product is a 46% alcohol by volume non-chill filtered whiskey. So Teeling was first established in Dublin in 2012, with the distillery officially opening in around 2015 by the Teeling Whiskey Company. It is the first new distillery to open in Dublin in over 125 years, and the first to operate there in almost 40 years, which I found very surprising to find out. It was established by two brothers, Jack and Stephen Teeling, whose father owned the Cooley Whiskey Distillery in 1987. The Cooley Distillery currently produces its own whiskies, respectively, and in 2011 was purchased by Beam with some conditions which I will mention a little bit more about in a minute. So whiskey distilling runs very firmly in the Teeling family's blood, with the first in their name being opened by Walter Teeling in 1782 in Dublin's Marylebone Lane. At this time, this was one of the golden places to create whiskey, given the large quantity of distilleries in the area. It was eventually purchased by Jameson, but closed in 1923 due to serious financial difficulties, in part affected by the American Prohibition. Jack and Stephen Teeling also worked for their father at the Cooley Distillery before beginning the Teeling business. So you may notice here that there is a bird right in the middle, and this logo represents the re-establishment of the brand, which I think is a very fantastic, wonderful way to pay tribute to your lineage. To kickstart Jack and Stephen Teeling's duo business venture, they needed barrels of whiskey. As part of the deal with Beam, they were provided 16,000 casks of aged whiskey to help get them going with the Teeling company. The small batch whiskey is the flagship product for Teeling, and it combines a combination of malt and grain whiskies. It is initially aged in ex-bourbon barrels, and it is then moved to casks for an additional 12 months that previously held Central American rum. So now let's have a little look, smell, and taste of this one. And again, feel free to explore this one or pass on this one. So this has a beautiful honey colour to it, but the smell brings in some really interesting complex layers. Orange blossom, allspice, vanilla, apple pie, blackberries, floral notes, toffee. Lots going on with the scent on this one. But they really pair together really, really nicely, despite that immense amount of scents. So on the palate, it is spicy and rich. There are notes of rose and lemon combined together for this one. Creamy vanilla, hints of dried herbs, cinnamon. Very light notes of brown sugar infused in this one. Notes of apple, nutmeg, Overall, the finish is floral and herbal, which is very interesting and fairly unique for whiskey. The finish is medium, with caramel at the tail end. Overall, this is a very creamy, robust whiskey, lovely and spiced. What do you think of this one? Interesting. Okay. So now we're going to be moving on to our final whiskey, which is our sixth whiskey for this whiskey tasting session today. So I have told you a little bit of the history of Tullamore Dew. However, I do have for you today a different product by them, and that is the Tullamore Dew XO Caribbean Rum Cask Finish Whiskey. This is a 43% alcohol by volume whiskey, and it was released in 2017. So for this particular version of Tullamore Dew, it is a blend of triple distilled malt, grain, and pot still whiskies that have been aged in ex-bourbon and ex-sherry barrels. It is then finished in first filled Demerara rum casks from Guyana. In comparison to other rums, a Demerara rum tends to be more full-bodied, with flavour, and has a more savoury and smoky characteristic to it. So that's why this pairs really, really well with Tullamore Dew. The company says that the inspiration for this whiskey comes from the fact that 50,000 Irish immigrants settled in the West Indies between the 16th and 17th centuries, some of whom went on to participate in the Caribbean rum trade. Many say that this is the perfect fusion of rum and whiskey. So let's have a look at this one. So this one has a radiant amber appearance to it, and a very, very, very tropical family of scents arise from this one. There's cherries in this one, mango, bananas, buttery caramel, classic rum spice though. On the palate, tropical, just like the scent, however unique in its own way. Instead of fruits like mango shining through like they did on the nose, fruits like caramelized pineapple really just burst through initially on the taste with this one. Lemon curd, brown sugar, oak spice. The whiskey for this one plays more of a secondary role to those beautiful, full-bodied flavours of rum. The finish here, orange to end, but a very long finish, complex with lots of flavours emerging right at the end. Ripe bananas, caramel, and some beautiful spices to end on this one. This is definitely a delight to explore for your nose and taste buds. What did you think of this one? A lot of people have a really surprised reaction to this whiskey, just because it does have so many essences of rum to it, despite there being no rum added, which really shines a light on the splendour of Demerara rum. I'm sure you won't be surprised to know that this specific whiskey has won several awards. It has won many silvers and bronzes, but it has won a gold in the International Spirits Challenge in 2020, and it won a silver in 2021. So this, I think, will be sticking around for quite a while. So that is all of our whiskies that we have here today to celebrate Irish whiskey. So before you go, I would just like to ask you, what were your thoughts overall about the whiskies? Were there any that surprised you, any that you liked or disliked in particular? Okay. So we would like to invite you to an upcoming whiskey tasting that will be happening in the next few months. You will be sent an email as to when specifically it will occur. It will be celebrating Welsh and Scottish whiskey. So we do invite you to try those whiskies in the next few months. Thank you for joining us for this whiskey tasting session which celebrated Irish whiskey. And we look forward to seeing you in the future for another whiskey tasting session. Take care. Goodbye.